Welcome along, everyone. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon if you're elsewhere, to this episode of In Conservation With. And I must say, in true kind of commercial fashion, that it's in association with Leica Nature and Birding and King's Place Music Foundation, and it's part of their Nature Unwrapped season. And also, I must mention that I'm doing a walk in October, and I think my great colleague Claire just put it up for you. Walk with the Urban Birder at King's Place on Saturday, the 3rd of October. So I've got to mention that. So thank you all for coming. Thank you very much, Gillian, in advance for coming. How have you been spending lockdown?
Wow, that's a very good question. It got a bit busy, I'd have to admit, a few weeks ago. I've even lost track now when Spring Watch happened. That was sort of, it felt like a 0 to 60 experience because we went into lockdown, and aside from all the other work that I do, hi everyone, by the way, that's like, oh, I just launched into that. I didn't even say hello. So hi everyone. And thank you, David, as well, for having me here. So yeah, lockdown, aside from Spring Watch, I do a lot of events and public speaking and speaking in schools, at universities, wherever they'll have me, basically. And in the space of about a week, as we were going to the inevitable lockdown, I think, by then we knew what was coming. I just watched my sort of online little calendar thing that I use to try and keep myself organized. I watched every single little colored square of an event just disappear. So by the time we went into full lockdown, I was like, okay, they've got no work and we're not even sure we can do the watches. So it was a bit of a scary time, if I'm honest, but I live in Cornwall, and I've got 2 kids. I've got a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old. And it's interesting, I've been talking to quite a few people just, as we're starting to kind of, the restrictions are easing, we're getting out a bit more. And the feeling I have at the moment is it seems to be echoed by some of the people I speak to anyway. So it's not a massive sample size, I've got to be honest. But certainly around here, there was a feeling that the full lockdown, in hindsight now, we're starting to think that was quite, I hesitate saying this because it's such a different experience for everyone, so I really apologize, and say this with the greatest kind of compassion for someone whose experience this wasn't, if this wasn't not your experience, then, I really want to honor that. But certainly for me and for some of the people I spoke to, there was something really precious about the kind of, that thing of like, you stop, everything has to stop and you're going to stay at home. And particularly because my kids, I've got a son who's 13. I'm going to mention them as well because they may well just walk through here, because they've got this kind of setup. This is the best place for me to be in terms of Wi-Fi. And unfortunately the kitchen is that way. And obviously you can see the door behind me. And so when I first started doing these things, they would do this like Mission Impossible style commando crawl round the back of my laptop to get to the kitchen. It was so distracting that I just was like, just go, just walk. Okay, so I apologize if you see little people walking past.
Well, we can't see them.
Yeah, not for now. They've closed the door. They're like, okay, we'll watch a movie. But anyway, back to lockdown, this age of like the teen, the preteen, I can feel their orbit starting to kind of leave, oh gosh, you can tell I'm like, I like being a mom. And there's something for me personally anyway about lockdown. It was really precious because we got so much time together that we would not have had. And we went on this daily walk, same route, we're very fortunate. I mean, I live right in the middle of town. It's kind of just a regular 2 up, 2 down sort of terrace house, but I'm 10 minutes from the coast path and the beach. So we would head out on the same route almost every single day. And so that was lovely, having that time together with them. But then that experience as well of watching the same little patch, the same route transform. At first I didn't really notice it, but then you started to like pick up on details. And that's not something I've done, if I'm honest, ever. Because I came to Britain as an adult and it's been busy the whole time. And before I had children, I worked in, natural history TV, but behind the camera, I did a lot of traveling. I spent very little time in this country, in Britain, like sort of watching and observing and being outdoors. So it was a really, really special time for those reasons, and also just that sort of noticing how other people in my community anyway, you know, were affected by lockdown. You know, there's a lot of elderly people here who live on their own. They sort of, you know, came to retire down here, and their families are up country. So watching the community come together to sort of keep tabs on, you know, who needed help, who needed provisions, and, you know, until the systems kind of picked that up, it was kind of left to just, you know, the community to sort it out. And so all those things were really special. But, you know, I say that, like I say, you know, with respect to people who, you know, may not have had that experience, may have hated it, may have like found it really, you know, overwhelming, whatever.
Yeah, confining. I mean, the thing is, I mean, for me, my lockdown experience was very draconian because I was in Spain. I am in Spain, and we weren't even allowed out to exercise. But what was interesting for me was the fact that I spent most of my life with people. And actually, funny enough, before the actual lockdown, before any of this actually burst into the scene, I actually was craving 2 weeks off just to sit down and just, you know, gather my thoughts, and end up having 5 months at least. Just to let you know, Zoomers, Gillian and I don't actually know each other. She's one of the very few people on this in conservation I've never met before. And what I've learnt about you, Gillian, just looking around, is that, you know, you give the impression to me of being a very thoughtful and private woman for start. And what I've also seen is that you're very much loved. Actually, I can see that online. I've noticed, you know, people saying how much they respect you on Springwatch, and they also, you know, like the way you look and all that sort of stuff. So it's quite heartening to see that. It's very heartening. So it's not often. I'm looking forward to meeting you in real life, in inverted commas, one day. It'd be very nice. We were talking, actually, before we started recording, we were talking about the weather, because, you know, that's what people do in England. Well, that's what people do generally. And I was saying how hot it is here. I mean, at the moment, it's like probably about 36 degrees now, and it's quite warm. And you were talking about the weather. And then you were mentioning something about the differences in the weather between Eastern and Western Europe.
Yeah, the weather. It's such a time filler, and then it's like this thing that drives, you know, everything. It's life, you know, it's life. So yeah, so, you know, just the kind of the time filler type conversation would be that I don't know how many of you watching here are, you know, sort of in Britain or abroad, but anyway, certainly over here in Cornwall, the last few weeks have been like unseasonably mild, very miserly and overcast and grey. Not like too cold, but, you know, there were a couple of nights definitely that I was really tempted to put the heating on. I was like, no, I cannot do that. This is June. We figure this out. And then I spoke to a few people like, oh yeah, I've lit the fire. It's really, you know, it feels damp and cold. And yet, you know, there's a Siberian heat wave going on at the moment. And I found it really fascinating because I was going to try and find his name, but I'm worried that if I get online that I'll drop this connection, but let's see what happens. It's going to happen. It should be fun. I followed someone on Instagram who I've only just discovered his site, and I think he's the same on Twitter as well. Scott from Scotland is his name, but it's Scott Duncan WX is his name. So I don't know if you do post show notes, so I can send that if anyone's interested. So he's like a climatologist. He produces these amazing graphics, and I'm kind of a bit of a, like, you know, I like to nerd out with that sort of stuff. Really beautiful images. So he's been tracking for the last month this Siberian heat wave. And what I find really interesting, well, you know, it's there's all sorts of things that are interesting about it. You know, so what we were talking about was the difference between the East and Western Europe. There's a difference of about 20 degrees, but it's separated by a band of air about 300 kilometers wide, which actually, you know, relatively speaking, is a really narrow band, and it almost runs exactly north-south. So it's like a perfect line, like chunking through probably what is Hungary, I think, or just west of Austria anyway, north-south. But the Siberian heat wave is something that, if I'm honest, is quite a concern, you know, for a lot of people. It's not being necessarily talked about enough in mainstream news and news outlets and media at the moment. I mean, there's sort of an awareness of it, but what it actually means is kind of not quite coming home. And if I'm honest, I'm only just sort of starting to go, wow, this is actually quite a big deal, what's going on there. So yeah, you know, that feeling of, God, it makes me think of all sorts of things. It's like, you know, that thing of like, until we start to experience something, we don't think it's real. And, you know, sitting here, you know, in my home where I was sort of, you know, cold in June, thinking about putting the heating on, to think that, well, it's, I think there are parts of Siberia that's hitting 38 degrees on a daily basis for the last few weeks. So that's quite, I mean, that's right in the Arctic Circle. So yeah, I mean, I'd urge you to check, if you're interested, that is, check out this page. I'll try and sort of share that with David somehow,
In fact,
or in the notes afterwards.
There's actually already found his Twitter account and put it up on the notes. So,
look at that, I love it. So it's because it's just a really accessible way of just getting like the detail of what's going on in the far north over the poles. There's like a big high pressure just sat literally across over the North Pole at the moment, and it's stuck there at the moment. So, you know, what that means, how it's driving the weather all around, you know, the northern hemisphere particularly at the moment, is brilliant. So this guy just crunches it down in a really accessible way. And I think at the moment, you know, there's so much information out there, it's difficult to know what to trust anymore, if I'm honest, you know, without getting too conspiracy theory about it. But you know, when I find a site like that, I really I make a point of like checking in almost daily, because it's sort of like that reminder of like, we are like this great big planet, and you know, everything is connected, and what I do here affects something, you know, it's that butterfly effect, and it's such a cliche, but it's true. So yeah.
It is totally true, and it's very scary because in Spain, I have access to the BBC World News Service, and they talk about stuff around the world. It's less about the UK, more about the world, and they've actually been covering the fact that spot in the Arctic Circle is 38 degrees. And what's frightening is that no one ever talks about the ozone layer anymore. It's like it's out of fashion, but that appears to be getting bigger, and people don't realize what that means, because that means more radiations coming into our, you know, into our atmosphere, which potentially means more cancer. But we just carry on blissfully doing what we're doing, burning our fossil fuels, you know, chopping down our forests and degrading our, you know, our resources. And it's just terrible.
Do you know, David, it reminds me of an experience I had as a kid. So if you just oblige me for a second, just a little story here. So I spent the first 10 years of my life in Kenya. That's where I was born. And my dad loved taking, you know, myself, the whole family actually, out on, you know, what they call safari. So we would, you know, I don't know why I did that. It is safari, you know. And so we would go to, you know, the Masai Mara. I was very lucky. I got to see these places before they got as busy as they are now. And I remember, I think this was in Nairobi National Park, actually. So, you know, just a day trip from where we lived. And we were going through quite sort of high sort of thickets. It's just after the rainy season, so everything was quite overgrown. And we had this little, like, it was a bit like a Suzuki Vitara, you know, very light Jeep, easy to tip over. I'm not doing them any sort of favors, am I? Anyway, so we're going down this track, you know, just bumbling along very slowly, and we come across a rhino. I don't know if it was likely a black rhino. The reason why I don't know is because we could just see its rear end, and it was obviously having a lovely little sort of browsing in this bush. So we could just see its head was tucked into that, and we had almost driven, like grazed past it. That's how close it was to the road. And so my dad had this sort of thing, which, you know, a lot of people do, is you sort of kill the engine straight away, then you bring the car to a halt and everyone's quiet. And we were just like, you know, it felt that thing that you could reach out and touch it. And then we sort of stayed there for what felt like a few minutes, just, you know, enjoying the moment, can hear the atmosphere, the sounds. And then all of a sudden, I mean, I am not kidding, like heart stopping, like crash of a sound in the opposite direction. And we turned round and there was another rhino. And it was like, you know, I mean, in my child's brain, it was coming for us. I doubt it was, but it was mock charging for sure. And, you know, it was this moment where my dad starts the engine up and reverses as fast as I've ever seen anyone reverse to get out of that situation. And I always think about that when I think about how we follow the news, because it's like we seem to have this kind of like, we're only going to talk about COVID. Now we're only going to talk about climate. And then we're only going to talk about Brexit. And it's like this inability somehow to assimilate and to go, well, how does climate and COVID work together? How does, you know, how does Brexit and climate work together? Sorry to use the B word, everybody. But yeah, you know, that thing of like, why is it so hard to integrate like all the things that are happening in the world, join up the dots and kind of go, could this be connected? You know, I know people do it. I'm doing news agencies a bit of a disservice, but you know, I think by and large that it feels like that. And like you said about ozone, you know, yeah, you know, that's another thing that's happening, but not being talked about. Yeah. So yeah, it's great that, you know, I think, you know, there's definitely a lot of people who'd make the effort to find information, especially now, but, you know, it's that sort of quality of information, you know, being discerning in terms of, you know, the reliability, the source, all of that kind of stuff, you know. So it's learning how to kind of navigate a huge, vast ocean of information, I think.
Yeah, the problem we have though is most people can't be bothered. Most people just take as read what is fed to them.
Or maybe they just trust, you know, and don't realize. I think there's a bit of that as well. Hey?
Yeah. I've been to Nairobi National Park, actually. I went there, I spent half a day there, and I saw about 250 different species of bird in half a day. And I was like, it was incredible. And also my guides, who were all from Nairobi, saw me as, and they call me Lucky Lindo, because I have something which is called the Force. I call it the Force. So, for example, we went to some arboretum in Kenya, in Nairobi, in the actual city itself. And they told me that there was some kind of Turako that lived there, but they haven't seen it for years. And I said, we will see it. And within 5 minutes, I didn't even have to look up because I felt something hit me on the head. I looked up and it was one of those Turakos eating some fruit and dropping the seeds in my head. And they couldn't believe it. They were like, so that was quite funny.
So amazing, actually.
You're born in Kenya, and I mean, your background's obviously not obviously, it was probably well known, but we're going to talk about it anyway in case people here don't know. You went from there to Vienna. Your mum worked for the UN, and she got, I suppose, a big job in their headquarters in Vienna, and I suppose you moved to Vienna. What was that like?
Okay. So I'm showing my age a bit here.
Don't say it means nothing to me.
Sorry?
Don't say it means nothing to me.
Well, no.
It means nothing to me.
Means nothing.
Oh, Vienna.
Forgot about that. It's like a blast from the past, that is. Oh my goodness. Yeah, the Vienna. So, oh man, yeah, you know, it's weird. Like I think I could project a lot onto the experience looking back, you know, like, oh, you know, this is what. So I'm really going to try and like answer that question from the perspective of 10-year-old me, you know, who didn't see the world the way I do now, you know, many, many years later. So, yeah, so, you know, I live in Kenya, and my days are spent, if I'm not in school, I went to a really strict Catholic school. So, you know, when I wasn't in school, I would mostly spend my time, you know, I sometimes think, wow, did anyone even know where I was? You know, but anyway, I had a lot of free time to myself. You know, where we lived was on the edge of a coffee plantation. So it wasn't like, you know, the bush or anything like that, but it was rural, actually, is what it was. And it's now where I grew up is now probably more like a suburb of Nairobi, but certainly back then it felt like on the outskirts. You know, it felt like you broke free of the city and you in, you know, what was coffee plantations. So I roamed around a lot. I think this is where I kind of really grew my interest and passion for insects and vertebrates and stuff, because that was mostly what I saw, because I was probably closer to the ground, is what I think. So, this is me, and I spent a lot of my time, pulling thorns out of my shins. There's plants, as you know, and if anyone's been, it's like every plant has thorns, it's like, so I spent a lot of time pulling thorns out of my feet and my shins. And then all of a sudden, my mom's like, oh, I actually don't even remember how it was announced, but anyway, all of a sudden we're going to Vienna, we're going to Austria. And the things that I remember were, okay, I know it's going to sound really weird, but the things I remember was that I was totally shocked that white people would collect the rubbish. So like the rubbish collection was done by white people, because in Kenya, white people would never do a job like that. So that was the first thing that I was really struck by, in a sort of like, this place is crazy, and I was like, what else? What else do they do? So stuff like that really was what I noticed. And this is the other one that's funny, because I didn't realize that Father Christmas wasn't Black. So that was a big surprise to me. That was like, okay, so my world, that was how I processed this change. Now I could make all kinds of other comments about it, but that was it. That was the level I operated on. But my parents, there was an international school, and that's where I went eventually, but there wasn't place in the international school for at least a year before for at least a year after we arrived. So what happened is, initially my parents, I just stayed home, they were like, well, we'll just wait. And it was clear that I was really sad and lonely, and, I needed that contact with other children. So eventually they were like,
were you an only child? Or?
No. I had an older brother, but he was 5 years older, and he got a place in the school. It's just there was no place in the year group I was supposed to join. So eventually they were like, oh no, we'll just let her go to an Austrian school because clearly she just needs that. And that was like a really amazing thing. I don't think it was for very long, but it was that experience of being with a group of children. I couldn't speak German. No one really could. Even the teachers could speak English. But it was somehow it worked. I don't know how, but I just played with people and with kids, and I mean, maybe it helped that I didn't understand what anyone was saying. I don't know, but I didn't really, I was just like, I was just so happy to have people to play with. And they were like, okay, we'll play with her then, So that was the way it happened, like, to the way I remember it as a 10-year-old. And, I look back now and go, wow, that was crazy, because I think that at the time there was only like a handful of Black families in all of like Vienna. So we were very visible minority. Yeah. But that's what I would say now. That's not what I would say back then.
Okay, so you came to the UK when you were 18, and you were studying and went to university, etc., etc. Let's fast forward to you joining the Natural History Unit as a researcher. When you joined, I mean, that's a route, seems to be a classic route for a lot of people in terms of, to become presenters. I mean, there's several I can think of straight away that follow the same route. What were your thoughts? I mean, when did you actually sort of suddenly realize I want to get involved in nature, in the natural world, as a program maker?
Okay. You're going to get a long answer to this, right? I hope that's okay. Because it wasn't straightforward, because I didn't, so I'm in Austria now, and I'm settled, and, many years later, the thing that I loved about being in Vienna was the access to theatre, and particularly ballet. And so, I just kind of went from, I call it bush to ballet sort of transition. I just did this massive 180 in my life, and really loved performing arts. And, at about 17 years old, I was like, I want to go to drama school. That's what I want to do. And then, kind of very long story short, it was mainly because I got like funding to go to university to do biology, because I was actually really good at it. And, and I thought, well, that's the sensible thing to do, because I don't, drama, like, am I going to get a job at the end of it? So I was trying to be really pragmatic about my decision making. And I ended up in Bristol because I'd applied to three universities in Britain. And one was Edinburgh, and I ruled that out because it was 4 years, and I was like, no, I can't do 4 years of uni, I'll do 3. So that was Scotland out. And then the other choices were, UCL in London. And I was like, okay, I can't afford to live in London. So it was Bristol. So, it was a process of elimination rather than, oh, Bristol's this place where they make natural history. I had no idea that's where they made natural history films. So that's why I ended up in Bristol. And I would walk past the natural history unit building almost daily on my way to and from lectures. And it just didn't occur to me, the penny didn't drop, that, there was some kind of thing going on there that I could be part of. And it wasn't until I graduated, I sort of spent about 2 years doing sort of really random stuff. And then I then I just thought, well, actually, maybe I should have a go at this. And, bearing in mind, this is what, in the late 90s, as the world's a very different place back then. And, I could have easily not done it because it was like, oh, this is the most competitive thing to get into. Everyone wants to work in this industry. But I figured I had a couple of things going for me. One was that I had a Kenyan passport. I only got a British passport when my son was born. So I had a Kenyan passport, spoke Swahili, if I'm honest, not brilliantly, but good enough. And I thought, well, that could work. I could go in there and say, well, I've got a biology degree and I can help you filming in Kenya. And it's sort of, and I spoke German and a bit of French and all that sort of stuff. So, I thought I've got languages and I've got, a passport they don't need to sort out work permits for Kenya. I can go work there for them. This is great. And so it worked. I got work experience in there. Then I started working as a researcher. And can I tell you, David, I still, to this day, have never filmed in Kenya. It's like, yeah, in case anyone's watching this who commissions films in Kenya. Can you believe it?
Amazing.
Yeah, it's never happened.
So what were you doing initially then? I mean, you were a researcher. What sort of things were you researching?
So I was a researcher on a series. The first paid job I did a lot of unpaid work experience, but the first paid job I got was with a production company called Green Umbrella. And they produced a series called Living Europe. And I got that job because I spoke German and enough French and Spanish to basically, set shoots up. But that was why I got that job. I had the biology degree plus the languages, and they're like, oh yeah, that'll work. So I went off on this track, researching a series about European wildlife, which included Britain. Let's get political about that. The wildlife doesn't know. So so that was the first gig I got. And then what happened is, because I started to get this reputation, so one of the first really detailed shoots I helped set up was about wood ants in the New Forest. And we had a permit to collect a colony, which was part of someone's research, but we got to film it the kind of the colony interiors and getting all the sort of lovely intimate shots inside the colony. But for a while, I kept that wood ant colony in my home, in my living room. And it was really cool. It was really fascinating kind of watching them. I would sort of leave mealworms and food around and watch trails form. And I know it sounds really grim if you're not into this sort of stuff, but they're actually very neat and very clean, animals, insects, the ants are. And it was just really fascinating watching how they fanned out. And you'd watch maybe some, exploratory, random searches. But once they found food, they were very efficient. They didn't just kind of cover everything. They'd form a neat trail to and from a food source. And then, of course, you reinforce that by always leaving food there. And they're like, well, this is easy. We'll just keep going there and we'll find it. So I loved it. So I guess people sort of thought, well, she likes this kind of stuff. So then the next thing I did was about spiders. And then the next thing I started working on was a series about snakes. And I started to get this reputation as someone who is happy to do the creepy crawly stuff, the stuff that nobody loves to do. So I never really worked on things about birds or mammals, Actually, that's a lie. I did actually do one grey whale shoot, which is pretty cool. But it was mostly invertebrates and reptiles. And the very first snake shoot, which is deep end, straight to the deep end, was in India, a film we made about king cobras. And again, you know, I was so conscientious as a researcher. Like I look back, I'm like, oh man, lighten up, child, you know. And so I set this shoot up. I was always worried, just had the weight of the whole production's responsibility on my shoulders, unnecessarily, by the way. And I set this whole shoot up. I did all the health and safety, you know, obviously someone else signing off on it, but I was sort of looking into it. Got on the plane, you know, cameraman, everyone's there, great. We got the kit to arrive in India, thank goodness, we've got everything, nothing's been lost on the way. We get to the location, amazing place. And it's where they do captive breeding. I don't know if they still do, this is quite a long time ago, but it was a captive breeding program for king cobras. And they were breeding them, bizarrely, they were breeding them on the East Coast, but for release on the West Coast. So they had to keep them in very secure enclosures in order for them not to escape from the facility. And that's where we were filming them. And so the first shoot, the first day, we got a little kind of safety briefing, and I got to, you know, we went into the actual enclosure. They bring this, and I kid you not, it's like a coffin-sized kind of box with the king cobra in it. I've got a little safety briefing, and the guys, the wrangler basically, amazing guy. He's God, I say that because I don't, well, anyway, he's, you know, he was already a real veteran. And he was an American guy called Romulus Whitaker, who lived in India for like decades and stuff. So he was very Indian in his mannerisms. So he had sort of his head, you know, kind of that thing of where you saying, you're saying yes, but it looks like no. And so he'd do that a lot. And he had like a hook, a snake hook. That was it. That was his kit. And so he gave us this little briefing about what's going to happen when the snake comes out, and it's going to like shoot out this box. But don't worry, just stand still and it'll calm down, and then we can start trying. Because what we wanted, we didn't want all the you know, the shots of this snake rearing its head up and looking all kind of defensive, which is obviously very entertaining and very dramatic. But what we were trying to do was, you know, get courtship behavior and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, you know, that was my first real encounter with snakes filming. And I really thought to myself in that moment, I was like, I don't even know if I'm okay with snakes, let alone a king cobra. But it was too late, you know, and the thing was like, just stand still and it'll be okay. And it was. I lived.
You did, yeah, thankfully. Did you want to become a presenter, or was that something that happened by accident?
No, actually, so I always took the view that you have more editorial control as a producer and director. You know, some very established presenters have a lot of editorial control, but when you're starting off, you don't. You know, and well, that was the perception I had anyway. So, you know, I was much happier behind the camera, and no, it wasn't. It was just not an aspiration that I had at the time. I worked, you know, so this snake series was with a South African presenter, and I enjoyed watching him work and his process very much. A guy called Austin Stevens, and he was, you know, really, really accomplished in terms of a herpetologist. So he didn't come at it from an academic point of view. He was the type of, like, you know, he was a herpetologist who had worked in lots of snake parts, had a lot of like experience handling particularly venomous snakes. And I had, you know, he's you know, extraordinary in his kind of intuitive sense around snakes and other animals as well, which I think a lot of people who work with animals do. You know, their knowledge comes not from reading lots of books and scientific papers, but from being like just hours and hours and hours of being in the presence of, you know, the animals that they choose to work with. And, you know, for me, that was such a learning experience, because if I'm honest, I'd left that behind in my childhood. You know, my connection with nature as a sort of teenager, and certainly at university, was really academic. Did some field work, but, you know, I mean, I still wouldn't call myself a naturalist. I'm not a naturalist, you know, I'm a biologist. Even that, I'm like, well, have I done active research? I'm a science communicator and someone who really loves, you know, the natural world. but yes, I had a lot of respect for Austin. I loved watching the way he worked with the animals. He was very, very in tune. And also his process. I really enjoyed watching how he understood when he needed to be on, and he understood when he was not. Like there were conversations that were happening with the director and the camera operator and all that sort of stuff. And he would just like power down, you know, and he would just almost like look like he'd fallen asleep. And then you go, okay, Austin. He'd be like, okay, you know, I'm ready, you know. And I used to watch that. I think that's a really good skill, knowing when you're needed and knowing when you're not.
Seen David Attenborough do that actually. I saw him give a talk once, and he was like, you know, like what he said, just powered down. And when they mentioned his name, he's like, bam, and he's ready for action. So it is a great skill. So what was the transition then? How did you get into presenting?
Oh God, I haven't answered your question, have I?
No.
How long has this taken? So sorry.
For 2 hours, guys.
Yeah, everyone dig in, guys. Get comfortable.
In for a long haul.
So how did it happen? Okay, I'm going to canter through this now. So I worked in production for almost, 10 years. And then I got to the point where I worked my way up. I got my first directing, like really fully fledged directing gig, about to go to Madagascar. And then I find out I'm pregnant with my son. And I thought, okay, that's not going to work because, you know, Madagascar, anti-malarials, all sorts of stuff. Anyway, so that's why I ended up working on a grey whale shoot. But anyway, I'm really trying to do this quickly. Sorry, everyone. And then basically after my son was born, it was really clear to me that I didn't want to be absent, you know, especially like with the early years. And then I had my daughter like almost 2 years later. So I actually was a stay-at-home mom for, you know, almost 7 years before I got back into TV work. So for that whole time, I thought, so I can hear the door creaking. Yes.
Yeah, I can as well.
Just go right through, just talking about it, might as well.
Hi.
She's like, I'm not going to do that. Anyway, so I was a stay-at-home mom, and I thought that was that. I thought that was the end of my TV days, and I was quite happy with that, if I'm honest. I thought I'd had a really good shot at it, and I'd seen some amazing places. And then once I moved down to Cornwall, I started thinking about how I was going to, as the kids were getting older, how I was going to like, okay, what am I going to do? And I started doing voiceover work. And I thought, well, this is a good way to make use of the knowledge of the industry, the contacts that I have there. And, you know, clearly I like talking. So I thought I'd do some voiceover work. And then that's how it started. Like I started sending my reel around to producers, and they were like, oh, you're going to do on screen as well. And at first I was like, oh, no. I know what you do to presenters. I'm not doing that. But then the conversation with the team on the watches happened. And actually it was the outgoing exec who suggested that it would be something that I should try. And I this is only like 4 years ago now. And at the time, there wasn't that much programming on TV about conservation, hardly at all compared to now. And certainly no one really talked about environments as urgently as they do now. And but the watches did, alongside, you know, the Nest cameras and stuff, you know, there was that. So I sort of thought, well, you know, this could work. So I sent them, I'd sort of been talking to an amazing guy called Matt Slater at the Cornwall Wildlife Trust, and he'd told me about this discovery, about this very obscure species of hermit crab that was thought to have disappeared. And, you know, they'd done a survey and it showed up on the beach, you know, in March of 2013 and, 2016. And and so I said, you know, it had gone extinct because of this big old oil spill in the 60s, the Torrey Canyon oil spill. And it sort of somehow found its way back to British shores. And I thought, that's a really cool story. That's like a really positive conservation story. This kind of, you know, the resilience of nature to bounce back. You know, I really liked that theme, and I still do. So I sent that to the watchers as like, do you want to cover this? And to my utter shock and horror at the time, they said yes. And just close the door behind you. Okay. She won't say hi. So to my utter shock and horror, they said yes. And I thought they can't possibly know how little these things are, and they're invertebrates, and they never, you know, nobody likes invertebrates, especially when they're little. And I was like, you do realize they're like the size of my thumbnail. They're really small. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. We're sending someone down. So, you know, they did it. And people they loved it. I still sometimes think that's amazing. How did they pull that off? But yeah, they loved the story. And then I started doing a few more guest items. And then, you know, well, I'm not gonna say the rest is history. That's too much, but you know.
We'll talk about Springwatch in a very second. I want to ask you one more question before we talk about Springwatch. And what was it like as a woman working behind the camera in this industry?
So again, I'm going to answer this question from the perspective of me, you know, back then, because the people didn't even talk like this back then. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was just my attitude at the time was, I need to be able to do this job as well as anyone else. Full stop. That was it. And so, you know, if in hindsight, I'm like, wow, there were some pretty, maybe slightly sketchy situations I got into, particularly like on the snake series when we were working in New Mexico and Arizona, and I was recceing, so doing like location scouting, quite remote ranches, you know, in places where I think you could easily disappear, if I'm honest, without sounding dramatic. And, you know, I look back now and like, if someone I cared about was doing that job, I'd be like, no, you can't do that alone. But I did, because in my view, I was like, well, and I don't know if I'm wrong or right to have thought like this, if I'm honest, but this is where I thought back then. I was like, I can't say that I'm nervous about doing this, because then it would suggest I can't do the job. And they need to just get someone who's not going to be nervous about going and location scouting on her own. So I did. And I'm pleased to report that by and large, I was always welcomed into places. I don't think I didn't have any real scary experiences. There was a story, but I'm worried that I'm going into many stories, but
we love stories here.
Am I? Okay. There is a story that I still can't quite believe happened, but it really did. So it is in New Mexico, and it was like the kind of classic desert rain scenario where it just chucked it down out of nowhere. And I had left the crew filming to go to the nearest point where we had like a cell mobile phone signal. So it was at least an hour's drive from where the crew were filming. They were filming rattlesnakes. And as I was coming to join the crew again, I was in this kind of 4x4, like bright yellow Nissan something. And I managed to get stuck in I'm so embarrassed, in a 4x4. I managed to get stuck in this like big sort of puddle basically. And I sort of reversed out. I kept charging at it, and I just thought, I can't. If I really go for this, I'm going to get myself really stuck. And I was thinking, what am I going to do? And I thought, I'm just going to sit it out, because the crew have to come back this way eventually. And then after a while, I could see this vehicle. It's like, you know, pickup truck kind of thing, approaching from a distance, because there's really nothing else out there. And I'm thinking, well, this is going to be interesting. I don't know who's the. And as they got closer, it was like a truck full of, you know, good old boys, basically. And I just really felt very, very vulnerable. And I just thought, deep breath. When they stop, just get out the car. I don't know why I thought that was a good idea, but I just thought, I'm just going to get out and like look like I'm okay, you know. And you know, they didn't say very many words other than like, you know, you okay? And I said, well, actually, I'm just, you know, getting a bit stuck. So the guy jumps in. Oh, I hate this bit, but he drives through, no problem. And I can't believe I'm telling you this. And it's only after then that I realized that they were hunters, and they were covered. That obviously, you know, just they had blood on their front. And I just thought, okay, thanks, bye. And they drove off. And I thought, oh my God, I can't believe that. So that's the sort of thing, you know, those are sort of situations I sometimes got into. And in hindsight, I'm like, oh, that could have changed, that could have ended so differently. So again, I look back at that and I think, oh, that was the experience as a woman. But at the time, I just had this attitude of like, I need to be able to do this job. and I need to do it as well as anyone else, or actually better. You know, I had that real sort of like, I'm going to prove that this is not a thing. It's not an issue. So that's how I approached it back then. But I don't think people would do that now. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, well, you showed a lot of courage, and that's something I think you need anyway, generally, whether you're male or female. You need to be sort of determined, I suppose, don't you? You need to be committed. But in 2016, great story, by the way. In 2016, you joined Springwatch. And what was interesting at the time, I remember at the time, I'm sure lots of people in the Zoom room remember too, and I'm sure you do, obviously, but it was a period of a lot of speculation in the newspapers about you joining. And some of that speculation was quite hostile. People were saying, you know, you're basically a victim of positive discrimination. I mean, I said to you earlier, I was approached by a tabloid newspaper to speak on it, and obviously I wouldn't. What was it like? I mean, did you actually feel that animosity at the time?
So it was, if I'm honest, like it was a shock, because my experience in the world, not completely, but by and large, and particularly in my industry, was that, you know, I felt very like I'd established myself as someone who, you know, people had hired for many years on many jobs and trusted with, you know, really big productions and big budgets to deliver, you know, right from content and story creation to actually, you know, sitting in on edits and fact checking, you know. So I felt like, you know, I had done like everything from making tea to producing productions. So it had never occurred to me that my credentials would be called into question by, because I just thought, well, why would they? Because, you know, I've done the job. So that was the biggest shock, was sort of realizing that my story and having to explain how I got to where I got was going to be somehow necessary in order for people to be convinced that I was worthy of this role. I then took the decision, though, if I'm honest. I guess, you know, maybe I'd like to say it's kind of getting older and wiser, David.
Are you hinting something?
No, I don't know what I don't know what I meant by that. I don't know. It was weird, wasn't it? Oh, God. Anyway, cut that bit out, okay? So, you know, my approach, which is probably, you know, a nice way of saying I just was like, I'm not going to deal with this, was I just thought, you know, I've only got so much time and energy every day. Like, you wake up and you know you're only going to get like 24 hours every day to, you know, sleep, eat, drink, and do whatever, you know, like make life happen, you know. And I figured that I could spend some of that time, really precious time, it's our most precious commodity really that we have is our time. I could either spend that time navigating and trying to deal with the situation and trying to kind of speak to people and convince them, oh no, you know, this is why I got this gig and da 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 da, or just do it, just do it, you know. And it was, if I'm really honest, it wasn't easy, because, you know, it knocked my confidence a lot, actually, you know. And I went through a really interesting exercise at the beginning of this year. I decided that I needed to do like a show reel of, you know, my presenter show reel of all this, you know, and highlights of things I've done. So, and I don't, if I'm honest, I don't really enjoy watching myself back at all. So, so it was a bit of a painful process. I was like, okay, Gillian Burke, you're going to have to sit down and watch everything right from the beginning and everything you've done and decide what bits you're going to put on your show reel. And it was actually such a good thing to do, because I started watching the really early stuff before this kicked off, right? And I thought, oh, actually, that was all right. You know, I was actually okay with this. And, you know, I could see why I got the job, because I was like, I did, you know, items about ladybird spiders that people loved, and, you know, the St. Piran's crab, and, you know, there's an item we did about bats, and I was like, oh, this is like, you know, I'm enjoying myself on screen, and it's engaged, you know, I'm engaged with it, so it hopefully is engaging. It's kind of weird critiquing yourself, but I was looking at that, and then I could see the point where it all sort of like came undone a bit, and I really kind of lost my way in the whole, like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? Do I even want to do this? Is it worth this hassle and the stress? but I kind of, I guess I like to think that I've got this like quiet little fighter in me. And there was just this part of me that was like, well, what's the option? You're going to give up? I was like, no, that it simply wasn't an option. So the only option I could see was just keep doing this. Yes, it's going to be clunky. Yes, you're going to have awkward moments, but get past that, reconnect with why you're doing it, which is because genuinely, I absolutely love our planet, the humans and everything else. I really do. And, as a kid, I always sounded naive. Like, I always had this thing of like, what do you want to do when you're older? Make the world a better place. And, as naive as that sounds, I'm like, I stand by that, because I'm like, actually, what is wrong with wanting to make the world a better place? Yes, it's difficult. And will that job ever be done? I don't know. But why not try? So that's kind of, and it sounds so worthy, but it is kind of, when the chips are down and you're not sure of yourself, then those are the things that have got me through, just like connecting to the values of why I'm doing what I'm doing. So, and I think, thank you for saying what you said right at the beginning, that I come across as I am a private person, although I've just told you loads of stories, but, but like, I kind of feel like this is a really nice situation because, I feel like I'm welcome into this space. And then I get to tell the stories, that matter and mean something to me, and hopefully kind of connect with other people, so to me, this is the way I like doing things. And I'm still not very good at, talking to like, when we have to do like the press rounds for, the publicity for spring, which I'm still really not very good at doing that, because I don't know how to speak like that. I don't know how to give journalists what they need that goes into print. And unfortunately, I learned from the experience of joining the Watchers that you can say something so innocently and then that can be lifted out. And so it's not that I don't trust, the journalists. I just think it's like a skill, like everything else. It's like they're there to do a job too, and and it's just like, okay, how can I help you? It's like, how can I make sure that the important stuff goes to print, what I consider important, which is the environment and the natural world, and how do people connect with that? And what I don't consider important is, did I get on with my team or not? That's like, I did, by the way, and I do. But it's like, the drama, I guess, is not important to me. So I'm still trying to work out how do you do those things and make sure that, things that I wish people to take home, and consider, get put into print.
Yeah. It is something that's very difficult to straddle across, I think. It's not easy. I think you need, I suppose in life, you just need to be really thoughtful as to what you say and do, and what you put online and what you put out there. You've got to think about everything you do, really. It's not something that's taught in schools and stuff. It's something you kind of learn by your mistakes, don't you, really?
Yep.
But we got a few questions, but I'm thinking that we're having a good chat right now, and I'm thinking that we kind of do some of these questions in the after show party.
Okay.
But we can't have a discussion at all without talking about diversity in nature. We've had the Black Lives Matter movement rise up again due to some really unfortunate instances recently. I just want to ask you, do you think, I wanted to ask you what you thought of that whole movement anyway. What was your stance on that, briefly? Mm-hmm. But also, do you think that there is a fatigue now when it comes to thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement and what it all entails? And also, do you think that people are jumping onto it as a fashion to sort of wave that flag as it's fashionable at this moment in time? And finally, as my four-part question ends, do you think that things will actually change?
Okay. Wow. Okay. So question one, what do I think of BLM? I mean, I think it's a good thing. I think it's a movement in its truest sense of the word, in that it was just an up, kind of a rising up of feeling and emotion and narrative that's been there for such a long time. And, you know, it wasn't organized in the sense that nobody planned that in February of 2020, sorry, not February, what I'm talking about, in June of 2020, that, you know, we're going to do this thing, we're going to take this on. It was sparked, as you say, by, you know, a series of unfortunate, well, yeah, it is a series of really tragic events, actually, that go back a long, long time. And I think that's what's hard to really, really get the weight of that, is that, you know, that I felt was, you know, the unleashing of a lot of trauma and pain and emotion and experience. And it's the little cuts and the big cuts and all of it together. And that's why it happened the way it did, because, you know, there was no leader. You know, I mean, there are now organized groups and there's organizations, but in the moment of that spontaneous rising up, you know, that just happened because a lot of people feel that there is injustice going on. So, you know, from that point of view, you know, I just think it's a good thing. It's a good thing it's happening. So in terms of whether there's, so question 2 was,
Do you think that people are just, well, do you think there's a fatigue now?
Oh, the fatiguing. I think possibly, yes, in the kind of fast turnover spaces of social media, so tweets and Instagram feeds. If you're not following specific accounts that are about campaigning for BLM, you will notice that there was, like, you know, maybe a couple of weeks where everybody was, well, I say everybody in my echo chamber was, you know, posting about BLM. And there was lots of stuff in the press. So that fast turnover of social media and news outlets, I think that's winding down a bit. But actually, in terms of activism, in terms of people feeling really ready for change, I think there have been all along people in this for the long haul. And those people are not, you know, we're not going to get tired, you know, of wanting this change. That's tired of explaining it, tired of justifying it, tired maybe of it, you know, the way things work in the world. But, you know, yes, tired of that, but tired of wanting change, no. And you know, what I find really interesting is I love watching stand-up comedy. I love it. And it's like, that's what I do to unwind, you know, I just like put on some stand-up. And I particularly like, you know, the kind of old school, like Black American sort of stand-ups, like Dave Chappelle and Michael Shea. So if you don't follow American sort of stand-up comedians, these are big names, right? But if you wind back to, you know, like sort of 25 years ago, even, where there was some real kind of like trailblazing kind of stand-up comedians like coming on the scene, they were still cracking jokes. Their stand-up is as relevant now as it was 25 years ago. It's my son.
Hello.
A hand. So, you know, that was still relevant, you know, so it's not like this is all new ideas, new thoughts. I'm like, oh, we're going to have a movement. This has just been going. And I think particularly in the American space, it's just so hard to explain how systemic and where this all came from. And I think for me, I'm learning a lot. I'm learning huge amounts at the moment of things that I didn't know. And I would consider myself to be someone engaged and interested. So I think, yeah, fatigue and like the sort of fast turnover spaces of our media, but not in the movement itself. I also, if I'm honest, like, I think some really good things are coming out of this. It's going to be divisive. It's going to flush out a lot of ugliness, I think, you know, it is already. But at the same time, there's some good things happening. So I've been approached just off the back of being invited to talk about this on Chris's self-isolating bird club that he's now, I think, doing weekly now. You know, just off the back of that, 6 minutes of chat, I've been, contacted by some organizations, in a very under the radar kind of way. So this is not about them getting the kudos and the publicity for doing it. But I really get the feeling that there's some people genuinely who are like, tell us how we can do this. We want to change and we're not sure how we can kind of restructure our organizations. How can we make our work more inclusive? How can we make the environmental space more, so the natural world and the environmental sector more inclusive? And, I don't have the answers to, many of those questions. I can just say how it feels and what I've heard and what I think. But it's opening up conversations that I haven't had with, even people I've known for like 20, 30 years. And I think that provided that, we keep kind of, this is going to sound so hippie now, but keep using the language of love to talk about this, and not try and use shame. I think I was listening to a brilliant podcast by Brene Brown called Unlocking Us. And she's, if you don't know who she is, she's a social scientist, but really brilliant storyteller and excellent speaker. Huge in the States, huge worldwide, actually. She's got a massive following. But her podcast, Unlocking Us, she does an episode where she's like white Texan. And she's like, I don't mean to exclude people, but this is for my white audience because we need to talk about this. And she just talks about shame and how it's a really destructive emotion, that very little good comes out of, so shaming people into change is not a useful thing. And I've never felt that either. So I'm a real kind of like, can we do this, but with the language of love? And there'll be people who shoot me down for saying that, but that's the way I operate. I'm like, sometimes you do need to say your truth, definitely. But, we need to do this together.
I am 150% behind you in that, because I've noticed, I totally agree with, the ethos of the Black Lives Matter movement, totally. But I've noticed that people have been hanging their hang-ups, their chips on this whole framework, and then using it as a platform to then point fingers and even to turn around and say to other people, you haven't been as racially abused as I am, so therefore you can't speak, even though they have no idea of that person's background. And what's interesting throughout this whole process, the last couple of months, in my life, I was born in England, born in London, and I was born and brought up during a very racist time. I was, when I was especially when I was older, 13, 14, spat at, bottles thrown at you, called names on the more or less daily basis from the age of 5 until I was about 14. And during that period of time, I kind of, even when I was young, age 8, 7 or 8, I kind of got tired of it. I thought, whoever's calling me a name, you're not actually calling me a name. You're just using a blanket word which someone else has told you, which doesn't even refer to me. So I kind of got into that mindset. I felt sorry for the people who felt they had to say what they had to say to try and, put me down. And as a young guy going birding on my own or with my friends, I realized that I was an ambassador, not just for birders. I was an ambassador for Black people, and I was also an ambassador for humanity, because I felt that this is, as you say, this is about love. This is about showing people love and making them realize that, you give them love when they feel that way, because they need something, they need love, these people. And I think, it's important that we don't forget stuff like that and not point fingers. Pointing fingers is the worst thing we can do, because then it starts this us versus them scenario. People start feeling strange and thinking that everyone thinks the same way. Because I've noticed the narrative when I'm spoken to by media outlets or people, they just automatically assume that you are going to say that those people are racist. X amount of people who are watching birds or into nature are racist. I don't believe that at all. I think that, it's very complicated, and it's not even about race half the time. It's about your background, it's about your culture, it's about lots of different things. So I'm really happy that you said that.
Yeah, I'm just going to close this because that's making the lens go crazy. But yeah, I would say narrative is a really important thing. And, as you could tell, I like telling stories. And I really believe that, stories are a very big part of this, what we're trying to do here. And I think, you know, the idea of like telling, you know, I kind of sort of say, you know, that like our version of the human story at the moment is only being told in a particular way. And, you know, and it's that acceptance that there's, you know, as you shift around, you know, perspectives, as you circle around, you know, the kind of, what is this human experience? What is it, you know, to be human and to be alive and all that stuff? You know, how do we experience life?
You wrote, sorry, can I interrupt you? Can I just interrupt? Because you actually wrote a beautiful paragraph in your Instagram, just saying what you just said. We are only hearing one tuneless, bastardized version of the human story, when in truth, there are many ways to show how we know who we are and the world we live in. And that is, I think, a very beautiful way of actually putting it all together. It's not just about black and white, it's about all of us. We're all on a journey, all of us.
Yeah. Thank you for saving me from myself there, because I was going to waffle on. I was like, wow, I wrote that.
Beautiful. Now, listen, we've kind of come to over an hour now. And I was wondering if you can stick around for the after show, because there's a few questions that people want to ask you. I want to ask you 2 more questions. What's your favorite bird?
Oh my gosh. And I know I've got to do this quickly, don't I? Okay. What's my favorite bird? Right now, because it's always different. Right now, I am championing the herring gull. I know.
That's right. You've got plenty of that where you are. Yeah.
Because I think the herring gull lets me tell the story of, like, we can't just enthuse and get excited about the things that are nice and the things that kind of slip in and, you know, and kind of fit in with our human lives. Like, herring gulls are such hard birds to champion because, you know, I'll go on about how beautiful they are, their adult plumage, you know, they are a beautiful bird to my view. I think they're really exotic because I didn't grow up here. So, you know, I still look at these things. I'm like, wow, they're seabirds, amazing. And, you know, so, and then I go on about, you know, they're red listed and their numbers are, you know, serious decline in their natural habitats and blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, and then we go on the beach here and I watch them act like proper a-holes, you know, and I'm just like, you know, mobbing people for their ice cream and their chips. And I'm like, guys, you're not helping me at all. So I like herring gulls because they challenge me and hopefully, you know, all of us to really kind of think we have to embrace all of it. You know, we have to make space for all of nature, not just the things that we like and the things that are cozy and the environments that make us feel good. We got to embrace the stuff that makes us feel uncomfortable, the things that, you know, steal from us. Because we steal a lot as well, by the way.
And,
anyway, I'll stop there.
And if you could be anywhere on this planet, notwithstanding the current pandemic, where would you be right now?
With my mom, because she's in Kenya and I can't get to her. But otherwise, home. That's it.
Okay. Well, listen, Gillian, it's been a really fascinating hour, and I've really got to know you a lot better, and I want to meet you now even more. I think you're a great woman, very strong and thoughtful, and you know, I love all that. So thank you very much for sparing your time today. Zoomers, thank you very much as well. It's been great to have you here. I'm not going to go through all the people that are coming up next because I think we could talk about it later, but thank you very much. And don't forget to look after each other as well as other people, and keep looking up.